All right, Tiffany. Like I said before, thanks so much for taking the time to be on this podcast. I appreciate it. My first question that I have for you is just give a little bit of an overview, a background intro of yourself, and just kind of how you started in the mental health realm.
My name is Tiffany Totah. I'm a marriage and family therapist out here in California. And I started the field originally wanting to teach. And through varying life paths, I went into human resources and really just ended up being in a classroom for children who were struggling with emotional issues and wanting to be a teacher. But then it led me down the path of being a marriage and family therapist.
hmm So tell me a little bit about the work that you do now in your current role.
Yes, thank you. So currently, I have a private practice, so I see clients one-on-one, and I also do online workshops, and I also have a social media platform where every Wednesday and Sunday I talk about varying mental health issues within a cultural context, and in this case, it would be Middle Eastern community.
hmm So, and like, what sorts of topics do you talk about within the Middle Eastern, community?
Well, it's no different than talking about anxiety or depression or panic disorder, or any kind of things like that within other cultural contexts. However, within the Middle Eastern cultural context, there are norms and expectations and cultural expectations that sometimes come up that Western ways of looking at therapy may not work or the interventions may not necessarily work within that specific cultural context.
hmm Yeah, it's nice that you mentioned that because I remember talking to Suzanne and we were talking about sort of the family dynamics. And, when it comes to dating, she pointed out that, if someone who is a Middle Eastern woman would marry someone outside of that cultural background, the family's not going to sort of be accepted of that or agree with that. So is that particular instance really common in a lot of your sessions with a lot of Middle Eastern individuals?
Well, I think it depends on, I don't know if it's common, but what I do know is the factors depend on how long perhaps a family may be here in the United States, the education levels of the family. It also depends on how integrated they are and their emotional health and wellness. So I think a lot of factors play into that. I try not to blanket everyone's experience. However, I think it is part of a cultural conversation we need to have for some people, for sure. I agree with Suzanne there.
hmm and I almost forgot to ask, what are some of the modalities that you use within your work with Middle Eastern folks?
Well, the modality, it's interesting. I typically will use cognitive behavioral therapy works. I do a mishmash. So anytime somebody asks me about modalities, I'm like, how about human connection? That's really what I focus on, not so much because you could do DBT, CBT, ACT. I tend to be more of the of let's just create a therapeutic connection. Let me get your story. So that's narrative therapy. Let me have value you as a person. That's acceptance and commitment therapy. Let's take a look at some of your behaviors. So that's cognitive behavioral therapy. So I do an eclectic um, because all of them have value and you can
hmm
use those interventions. I really struggle with that question a lot because I focus more on my connection to my client and how am I showing up and how are we a good fit. I focus more on that than the modality.
Gotcha. Yeah. Um, I guess my next question is, what are some of the take me in through like the sessions, what do they look like? So somebody shows up to your private to an appointment with you, and what's the session look like?
Well, the first session, well, first I do a pre-session. So I talk to every client before any client before they come see me. As a clinician, I always let them be aware I'm not everybody's cup of tea. I want to make sure I have the expertise for what they may be looking for. Also, my personality, I tend to be more open in session, more demonstrative. If they're looking for the blank slate, I'm not that therapist. I'm very interactive with my clients. Um, so I always let them know ahead of time, and they have to be ready to do the work, meaning uh, I tend to also, here's another modality, solution focused and really increasing people's capacity for tolerating life stressors. And if someone just wants to come in and talk, which I value talk therapy and I think it has a good space for that, but if it's not followed up with action, I know that for myself, that's not going to be a good fit. And it's not going to be a good fit for the client. If they just want to come in and talk and not do the work, they're going to have a real hard time in session with me.
Hmm. You hit on another important point, which is the authenticity between and sort of the connection between the therapist and the client. How, I guess my question is, like, how important is it for a therapist to be authentic and sort of connect with the patient? Because oftentimes, you know, when people go to therapy, they don't have that connection or kind of that interaction feels scripted. So
Mhm.
so how important is it, I guess?
Oh, for me, it's extremely important. Know thyself. I have to walk my own talk. So if I let my clients know, do not glamorize, like, do not think I'm this completely healthy, integrated person sitting on the other side of the screen or in front of you, that therapists struggle just as much as anyone else, and it's the degree that I'm doing the work. I can only take my clients as far as I'm willing to go myself, and I let them know I do a lot of work so that I'll be able to support them for for any length that they would need. And I'm not afraid of that. I'm not afraid to show up vulnerably, um, to some degree. I mean, I still hold very proper boundaries in this session, but I'm not afraid to connect with my clients. So if they ask me a personal question, I don't make it this big thing. I just, if they ask me if I'm married or ask me if I have children, that for me to process with, well, why are you asking that question? I don't do that. I just answer it because I know that being on the other side and they're sharing intimate details of their life, that they also want to know some parts of who I am as a person, and I'm totally okay with that. That's part of the healing journey.
Hmm. It is, and it goes to this other point that Suzanne mentioned that when um when in the session when you have a therapist and a client, it's important that the therapist, particularly those who want to study, not study, but work with Middle Eastern patients, but who therapists themselves don't identify as, she said that it's important to not assume. It's important to learn, to understand, do the research, that kind of thing.
I think it goes for any community, uh, whether it's Middle Eastern or Asian or any community, really, uh, to be open to listening to their story. And just because someone comes from that community, it doesn't mean that um, that may be their experience. Like I said, you have to look at each person as an individual. And yes, within these larger cultural contexts, but again, that's just one part of who they are. And how are you going to stay open and curious and learn? Even coming from the Middle Eastern culture, I am still learning from my clients because being brought up in America is very different than someone who was brought up in another country and then they're coming here. Or I grew up in a city. It's very different than someone who may have been brought up in a rural setting. So, yes, I think with anything as a therapist, one of the key things is to be open, curious, explorative, and find out what your client's story is, I think is the most important thing. And
Hmm.
it may be unique even outside of these cultural contexts.
Yeah, which gets into my next point of like when you're in a session with clients, what are some of the main key themes that you notice that are being brought up?
Uh, okay, good question. So I think the number one thing I see is the core belief of I'm not good enough. I see that every day, all day long. Uh, the vast amount of stressors that I think social media and being inundated with so much information that we may be more connected technologically, but we're becoming more disconnected. Um, so there's a lot of loneliness, a lot of people feeling alone. Um, so it's interesting. There's so much more connection, yet loneliness is another big one that I
Y-
see.
Yeah.
Isolation is another one that I see.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember, when I was at this restaurant with my mother, we were having dinner, and I could see like a family, a family right next to us, and they were all like with their cell phones like this.
Mm.
No human connection. I'm just like appalled, you know?
Well, and a lot of times what's happening is it's so easy to get distracted. And how do we stay present? Even it's just so important to not only stay present to the people in our life, but to stay present to ourselves. And so much doom scrolling and people just kind of mindlessly um, consuming content without being more mindful about what they're consuming, and is it keeping them from doing the things that they truly want to do in their life that's going to be more fulfilling. So I see that a lot. Those are oh, and stress. The amount of work, also because of technology, people, it's, here I'm going to sound like an old lady. Back in my, you work 9 to 5. Nobody, your boss couldn't get a hold of you after 5 o'clock, right? On the weekend, but people are constantly plugged into their work phone, their work life. Email comes in, or they feel like they need to respond, and it's really causing significant burnout, which is another thing I see.
Hmm. What
Mhm.
are what's one thing that you learned as a mental health professional, like in with these sessions with clients? What's one thing that you learned,
From my clients,
like from working with clients? Yeah.
I learn things daily. I learn that we need to be compassionate with ourselves. We need to be patient with the process. That sometimes when we're breaking cycles or generational norms, or it could be there's a significant amount of grief that may come with that. I learn about our sense of belonging, and where do we find our sense of community? And it doesn't necessarily have to be our families, and that can cause a lot of grief. I learned that doing the healing work sometimes requires letting go of what we thought life would be. Lots and lots. I could tell you, I learn every single day something new, or a lesson that needed to be repeated.
Hmm.
That's what I love
And
about being a therapist.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and I always ask a therapist is what's one thing that you want to learn or that you're curious about learning more of? Like, oh, I never th I thought I'm really curious about this.
Uh, Currently, I'm really curious about how we can use technology to um, create more community, but more authentic communities. Uh, how can we bring people together? So, yes, technology is an issue, but how can we transform it to really connect people in real ways? So, I'm learning more about social media platforms, learning more about creating workshops that are accessible to everyone, and that's a whole learning curve for me. I prefer in-person I prefer group workshops where you're actually seeing the people and shaking hands and sometimes a hug, you know. So this is learning the technology piece is a huge learning curve for me because
Yeah,
yeah, I've
yeah,
just
it's those information bubbles, information silos that get us so trapped.
absolutely yes.
And finally, to wrap this up, what's one piece of advice or like recommendation you would make to students, who are wanting to enter the mental health field that may want to target the Middle Eastern population, be more curious about it?
I would say for anyone, whether it's Middle Eastern population or not, if you're entering this field, to really be sure what your intention is to get into this field. I think there's a lot of glamorization of what it's like to be a therapist, and you really have to know yourself and understand why you're doing what you're doing. And uh, so my advice to anyone who wants to get in the field is try and work in the field first, doing uh, peer counseling support or working in a group home or depending on the population that you like to work with, to do some volunteer work, CASA worker, and get a sense of what it may look like. And then you can determine whether or not that's something um, you want to do. Because once you're committed in your graduate program, uh, you may get a rude awakening of what the work is really like. And I just don't like people wasting time or their money because college is expensive nowadays. So go do the volunteer work, talk to therapists, really get a sense of what it is. Because you're going to hear a lot of heavy things and a lot of challenging things, and you're not just sitting there listening. Yes, you're doing active listening, but you're also really trying to look at the person holistically. It's a lot more energy than I think than just people thinking you're just sitting and listening to people.
Yeah.
So you need to be ready for that, and you really need to work on yourself. The more you can work on yourself, the more neutrality you can have in the room.
Mm-hmm. All righty.